What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to show you how I paint the black armor of my Necrons, as well as the blue energy lines of inset runes and glyphs. In order to make these videos as informative as possible, I have included as much of the painting process as necessary. However, in the interest of cutting down on the video time and length, I have chosen to speed up these parts. If you want to skip these parts and just jump to the next step, you can use the timestamp links in the video description below. So to paint the black armor on my Necrons, I use 4 colors. I use Vallejo flat black. Make sure it's not glossy black, but flat black. I use dark flesh tone from Vallejo's Game Air range. And then I use Fantasy Games Hykey Yellow. So these 3 form my primary shadows and highlights. And then for my weathering and my edge highlights, I use Medium Sea Grey, also from Vallejo's Model Air range. So the reason I use these 3 colors, I like a bit of warmth to my black, particularly for this color scheme because it is a warm marshland desert. I want a lot of my colors, and the black in particular, to have a bit of a warm tone. So by mixing these 2 as part of my base coat, and then highlighting with this sort of a yellow tone, it adds a bit of a warm brown earthy tone to the color while still keeping it fairly gray. So you can see, especially in this spine element right here, you can see how as the highlights get brighter and brighter, there's a warmth to it. It's not just a cool flat gray. It's got a nice warmth, a nice earth color, earth tone to it that I really, really enjoy. But as we push it closer towards the shadows, it goes back to our black. Now, I avoid using flat black except in my deepest shadows, just so that it, again, doesn't look flat. Black is one of those colors that's very difficult to paint for a tabletop miniature because it's very easy for the mold to look unpainted or for it to look flat and not very interesting. So to demonstrate this process, I'm going to be painting one of the steps on his dais. Now, I've primed the model with Vallejo's Surface Primer Black, and then I've gone in with an airbrush and actually done a base coat of, I would say, 70-30 black and this dark flesh tone. So again, this helps to avoid a completely flat, bland black base coat, and I can start building up my highlights from there. So one of the things I like to keep in mind is how bright I'm going to be taking my highlights, both as a part of the model. So how bright is this going to end up looking on the model itself? And then because I am mixing all these different tones together, how bright is my mix going to end up being as I'm applying it? So medium sea gray is a fairly bright color, but Hykey Yellow is obviously brighter, and it can be very easy to get carried away as I'm mixing this to over highlight and end up with a highlight that ends up brighter than this, which makes it difficult to then go back in and of course do my edge highlights. So what I like to do is keep just a dot of this medium sea gray on my palette, and this lets me gauge as I am mixing my colors exactly how bright I end up taking my highlights as I apply them. So that's going to be my point of reference. So my mixes are never going to end up brighter than this color. Be careful when you're painting with this dark flesh tone and with the Hykey Yellow. They are fairly diluted colors right out of the bottle. They're very runny, and too much will just run all over your palette and make a mess. So just apply a little amount and then just drop more as you need it. I'm also thinking about this particular piece that I'm painting, where it sits on the model. It sits right there on the dais. It covers up this portion right here, but it is the frontmost part of the model. And yes, I know Szarekh, I think he sits on this top plate right here. And he has a bit of a cape that swirls on top, but it doesn't really hide too much of it. I'm about halfway through the model, or halfway in terms of height, so this piece is going to get fairly bright. There's a bit of a darkness here, Most of my highlights will be concentrated on this edge and on this surface right here, this panel, working my way down. But it is going to get fairly bright. So I established my base tone, which is black with a bit of dark flesh tone. And now I'm mixing in my Hykey Yellow. And this is just a process of, as it is for the rest of this army, working through layers, working up my highlights, and then applying glazes to tone everything back down. I'm being careful not to get too much paint into the recesses. These runes are important to keep clean because I want to be able to have my oxide in there afterwards to just add that blue color. And if we get too much paint into this, it can make it harder to apply a clean or have a clean application of the oxide afterwards. As with painting the white armor, I'm not too overly concerned with, one, having perfectly smooth transitions, and two, hiding all of my brush strokes. When I'm painting this army, I actually want some of the brush strokes to show through. Once again, it helps to add that textural element, and it allows me to work very quickly and not be slowed down by just making it technically perfect. So as I am applying my highlights, I'm sort of thinking through how I want the illumination of this model, the highlights to actually look. Because we have a fairly ambient light source in the environment and my light is coming from sort of a 3/4 top down from the front, in theory, these top panels should be illuminated fairly evenly across. However, I'm taking a bit of a creative license and I'm focusing some brighter spot highlights on this round portion right here, this front element down here, because I almost want to give the impression of a spotlight, just a subtle one, a faint one right here, leading up the steps to where Zara stands. I want to draw a bit more attention to him as the focus. And because I know that this part of the model, this front area, is a lot of black, I want to create a little bit of variety in the tone and to add a point of interest where I think the focus of the model will be. And so rather than highlight it like it should be very uniformly on this flat plane, I am creating a round transition. So my brightest highlights are going to be focused here, and it'll dip a little darker right there. And I'm progressively getting darker as I go up, or it's darker as I go down, and brighter as I go up to the top of his dais. And once again, I am just keeping this medium sea gray in mind as I am mixing my colors. I want to make sure that no matter how bright I go, it never gets brighter than that medium sea gray. That's my upper limit, my point of reference. I'm going to concentrate because these runes are going to be glowing a little bit. They're going to have that blue energy. I'm also concentrating some of my highlights just around these orbs. Not too much. I want it to be subtle. I don't want it to draw too much attention. Um, this is also partially because I am applying my Nihilakh Oxide to give the illusion that these runes and glyphs are glowing. I will not be edge highlighting all of these little parts. And so I'm just going to make sure that I add a bit of highlighting with this layering step. And this helps to sell that illuminated effect. Okay, and that's our basic layering done. Just like the armor, we're going to go back in with some glazes to smooth this out. There's some imperfections in the layering that I'm not entirely happy with, and I just sort of want to tie everything a little back together. And to do that, we're just going to take our black with our dark flesh tone. We're going to mix a glaze together, and we're just going to glaze into our shadows. As with glazing, a little pigment goes a long way, and don't be afraid to spend a bit of time just to build up your layers. The more time we spend with this, the more patient we are with layering our glazes, the smoother our results will be. Similarly, if you spend more time with the layering effect or in the layering step, you end up having to do less work in this glazing step. So it's all just about your comfort with the techniques, how many corners you want to cut, and how quickly you want to go, balanced out with the overall effect that you want. Now, this, despite being a centerpiece, despite being a one-off and the supreme commander of my army, this is still ultimately for me just a tabletop centerpiece, and so I'm not spending too much time on this. I'm not trying to make this model perfect in every which way, but I do want it to look good. And as I mentioned in my intro video, I am painting this model exactly like I would the rest of my Necrons. Okay, with the glazing done, it's time to do our chip weathering and our highlights. We do that in a similar manner to the armor. We're going to use first a piece of sponge, get a bit of a rough texture to it, and we're going to use some tweezers. And then we're going to apply our medium sea gray as our sponge. Now, unlike the armor, I don't two-step this. I just do a one-step with the medium sea gray. So you can do this before or after you do the edge highlights. It's not a big deal. And we're just sponging, and we're focusing this weathering, this damage. One, because there are steps on where I expect the feet to drag and to scuff and to end up kicking the dais. And then I'm also focusing primarily on the front, where all the enemy fire is going to be coming from. These are also very useful and handy for picking out cat hair from my models whenever they do appear, which again happens often. And then once we're done with the sponge chip weathering, we're going to go back in with a brush and medium sea gray, and just using the flat of our brush, much like the armor, we're going to very carefully highlight the edges. Now, as I mentioned in the armor video, Games Workshop, in their infinite wisdom, has decided to sculpt in the battle damage onto their newest Necron models. So unfortunately, this means that their armor is not perfectly smooth, and these edges are not perfectly sharp. A lot of them will have an unevenness where the armor dips and divots from where they have added the battle damage. And so you want to be careful as you're applying your edge highlights that you're following the raised edges of the sculpt. And you're not overpainting highlights to where the damage ends up splitting. And then similar to the armor, I like to go in with my brush and just add a few surface scratches where I think we could use a bit of additional texture. Whether it's because I'm working around where my brush strokes are, or I'm just adding a bit of extra information, make it a little more interesting. It's a very organic process. And then the last step is to do the runes and the gems. Um, I'm not going to show you how I do the gems. They're painted in the same way as the blue energy I showed in a previous video, so that's fine. But we want to paint the runes first. Now to do this, we're going to be using Nihilakh Oxide. Now this is a bit of a tricky step because it requires brush control, and we sort of want to take advantage of the capillary action of the paint, the liquid. We want it to help flow into the runes as easily as possible. Now, I'm using my fine detail brush, my size 2. It's got a better tip. And most importantly, it's got a nice deep well. So to really make this step easy, there's 2 important factors that we're going to need. We need a brush with a very good tip, and then we need the brush to have a very deep well to hold color. Beyond that, it's just brush control. And then I'm going to show you a little trick that can help aid in this capillary action. So we're going to wet our brush, get some water in there, and we're just going to paint some water into the rune where we want the color to go. Now, because the water will evaporate quickly, we don't want to do the entire thing. We're going to go piece by piece. With the water in the rune, we're then going to load up our brush with some oxide, and we're just going to dip it in. We're just going to dab it into the rune and let the water, the moisture that's already in there, help pull the paint off our brush and into the recesses. And because the water has already filled the where the rune is, this capillary action is going to take the oxide from our brush into the glyph and help even out the color. Now, because we are using water, of course, what this means is the application initially will be diluted. We have to do several coats, but this is easier, I've found, than trying to one-shot it and getting paint everywhere and then having to correct. Get more water, load our brush, and dab. We're going to let that dry, and then we're going to do another pass. And we may end up having to do 2 or 3 passes depending on how the paint has dried and how solid of a color it ends up being versus what we want to look. because these balls, these orbs, are going to be painted in our blue energy color, I'm okay just covering them in this oxide. I don't mind if they're a little tinted. Now, when you're applying the water, it's okay to not paint within the lines, as it were, because we're applying it specifically in the rune. The water is going to flow in there anyways, and then when we apply our paint, it's going to stay fairly within those lines. It's not really going to burst over unless we smash our paint on the top surface. And you see I've applied a little too much water here, and it's not flowing as nice as I'd like. So I'm just going to pull some up with my brush, and then just once again going with the oxide and dab. Now there's other ways that you can. So effectively what the water is doing is it's helping to break the surface tension. We're taking advantage of the smoothness of the water to break surface tension, and then through capillary action, pull the oxide into the rune. Another way that you can do this without using water, if you were, for example, using oils and oil washes take advantage of this, is applying a gloss varnish. The gloss varnish helps to smooth out the surface. It breaks the surface tension so the paint doesn't just sit there. It'll more easily flow into crevices and recesses, and then makes just the entire process so much easier. I've decided I don't want the center line to be a rune. I've realized that that's actually where in assembly the two plates meet. So I'm just going to go back in with some black and redefine that line. It's also because I think the contrast of that black line with the gray right there will look a little better than just having the three thin blue lines. The problem is then visually when you have the really thin lines of blue, gray, blue, gray, blue from far away, when it starts to blend together and the mind combines the information, it's going to naturally just combine all that blue into one thick, messy line. And we're going to lose that distinction of the armor. But you can see from far away that the black line really helps to pop. It separates the elements. And then visually, our mind has to think, okay, well, it's gray. There's a blue line. There's the gray edge. And then boom, black. It separates it. It creates that distinction, that point of interest, rather than blend and blur everything together. So to apply our second coat of the runes, we're just going to do the exact same thing. We're going to apply a bit of water. And then dab our oxide in. Now you can see as I get to applying more of this oxide onto these orbs, that they've base coated fairly consistently. They've covered very nicely. And so I probably won't have to go back with Caribbean blue to do a base coat. I can just paint my highlights directly on top of this oxide base. And initially, this is why when I first painted the army, I was using just pure oxide, because all I was really doing was the energy runes on small pieces like this, where I didn't need to worry about applying a nice even base coat on a large surface. It was only really when I started getting into the newer Necrons, and they had these massive energy blades, that I had to reconsider, well, okay, now that I'm having to highlight and paint such a large surface, the oxide isn't going to cut it as my base coat. So and that's it. That's how I do the black armor on my Necrons, and how I paint the glowing runes. So to highlight the orbs, all we're going to do is, as our blue energy, we're just going to take white and highlight it by mixing it with our oxide to brighten up those orbs. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to check out the other videos in my Necron Szarekh series. Don't forget to subscribe for more awesome weekly content, and to check out my Instagram as John the Ho for daily updates on my hobby projects. Until next time, happy hobbying.